What if the biggest obstacle in North American trade negotiations isn't tariffs at all but trust? Over the past several weeks, one short exchange between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and reporters has attracted outsized attention. During a press conference, Carney rejected the use of a particular phrase that had appeared in media reporting about the ongoing U.S.-Canada trade discussions. His response was brief, but it raised a much larger question. If the language being used publicly doesn't match what negotiators are saying privately, how should we interpret what's actually happening behind closed doors? At the center of this debate is the future of the Canada minus United States minus Mexico agreement, better known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States. Since replacing NAFTA in 2020, the agreement has governed more than $1 trillion in annual trade between three of the world's most interconnected economies. For decades, the North American supply chain has functioned as a single manufacturing ecosystem. A vehicle assembled in Ontario may contain components produced in Michigan, electronics manufactured in Mexico, and raw materials transported across multiple borders before the finished product reaches consumers. Any disruption to that system affects far more than customs paperwork. It influences investment decisions, factory production schedules, employment, and ultimately consumer prices. That is why every review of the agreement attracts significant attention from businesses, investors, and policymakers. According to publicly available reporting, recent discussions between Washington and Ottawa have extended beyond traditional tariff disputes. Officials on both sides have continued negotiating a wide range of issues, including agricultural market access, digital regulation, automotive trade, and provincial restrictions affecting certain imported products. Several media organizations have also reported that U.S. negotiators have sought progress on specific Canadian domestic policies before broader negotiations advance. Those reports describe disagreements over provincial alcohol distribution systems, Canada's digital regulatory framework, and long-standing dairy supply management policies. Canadian officials have acknowledged that these issues remain part of ongoing discussions. However, they have generally avoided characterizing the negotiations using the same language that has appeared in some media coverage. That distinction matters. In international diplomacy, governments often disagree not only about policy, but also about how negotiations are described. Public language can influence financial markets, domestic political support, and the negotiating positions of both sides. A single word may shape public expectations long before any agreement is signed. Prime Minister Mark Carney's background helps explain why his wording has drawn attention. Before entering politics, Carney served as Governor of the Bank of Canada during the global financial crisis and later became Governor of the Bank of England throughout the BR exit period. Both positions required careful public communication, where every statement had the potential to influence investor confidence and market behavior. That experience appears to have carried into his current role. Rather than adopting emotionally charged language, Carney has consistently framed the negotiations as complex but manageable, emphasizing Canada's economic resilience, diversification efforts, and long-term strategic interests. Whether that communication strategy reflects optimism, negotiation discipline, or simple message control remains open to interpretation. Meanwhile, the broader trade environment continues to evolve. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner by a significant margin. While Canada supplies critical energy resources, industrial materials, and manufactured goods that support major sectors of the American economy, the relationship is highly interdependent, meaning that prolonged uncertainty creates costs for both countries rather than only one. As a result, both governments face competing objectives. Washington seeks to address issues that American industries and policymakers have raised for years, while Ottawa aims to preserve market access without making politically costly domestic concessions. Finding the balance between those goals is rarely straightforward, and that brings us to the central question of this video. Is the current disagreement simply another round of hard bargaining that accompanies every major trade negotiation? Or does it signal a broader shift in how North America's economic relationship will be managed over the coming years? To answer that, we first need to understand how modern trade negotiations actually work and why leverage often matters just as much as tariffs themselves. To understand why these negotiations have become so contentious, it's important to recognize that modern trade agreements are no longer just about tariffs. 40 years ago, trade disputes often centered on customs duties, how much tax one country charged when products crossed the border. Today, tariffs still matter, but for highly integrated economies like Canada and the United States, they're only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The more significant issues are frequently what economists call tariff barriers. These include regulatory standards, licensing rules, government procurement policies, agricultural quotas, digital services regulation, environmental requirements, and provincial or state-level restrictions that can influence market access without technically imposing a tariff. In many cases, these measures have a greater economic impact than tariffs themselves. That's one reason negotiations surrounding CUS have become increasingly complex. According to publicly available statements from both governments and reporting from multiple news organizations, several policy areas remain under discussion. One involves Canada's provincial alcohol distribution systems. In several provinces, imported alcoholic beverages are sold through government-controlled retail networks, a structure that has long been criticized by some American producers as limiting market access. Another area involves Canada's digital regulatory framework, including legislation affecting online streaming platforms and digital services. Canadian policymakers argue these measures support domestic cultural industries, while some U.S. officials and technology companies have expressed concerns that the rules create uneven competitive conditions. Agriculture presents perhaps the most politically sensitive issue. Canada's dairy supply management system has existed for decades, regulating production while restricting imports through tariff-rate quotas. Supporters argue the system provides predictable income for Canadian farmers and strengthens domestic food security. Critics, particularly within the United States, argue that it limits competition and reduces opportunities for American agricultural exporters. These disagreements are hardly new. Similar debates appeared during the original NAFTA negotiations, resurfaced during the creation of USMCA, and continue today because they involve domestic political priorities rather than temporary trade disputes. That distinction is important. Trade negotiators often face to very different audiences. Across the negotiating table, they must persuade foreign counterparts to compromise. Back home, they must convince voters, businesses, and lawmakers that they did not surrender national interests. Those objectives are not always compatible. As a result, many negotiations proceed through incremental bargaining rather than sweeping agreements. This brings us to another concept that helps explain current events negotiating leverage. Leverage is not simply about economic size. It comes from each side's ability to impose costs or absorb them. The United States centers negotiations as Canada's largest export market. Roughly 3-quarters of Canadian merchandise exports are sold south of the border, giving Washington considerable influence over sectors ranging from automotive manufacturing to energy and forestry. Canada, however, possesses important leverage of its own. It remains a major supplier of crude oil, natural gas, electricity, critical minerals, uranium, aluminum, and other industrial inputs that support American manufacturing and energy security. Supply chains in sectors such as aerospace and automotive production also operate across the border multiple times before final assembly. Because of this integration, prolonged disruption affects producers in both countries. Analysts often describe this relationship as one of mutual dependence rather than one-sided dependence. That reality changes the dynamics of negotiation. Instead of seeking outright victory, governments frequently attempt to maximize leverage while minimizing domestic political costs. This may explain why public messaging often sounds more confrontational than the negotiations themselves. Public statements serve multiple purposes. They reassure domestic audiences, strengthen bargaining positions, and sometimes influence expectations before formal agreements are reached. Open source reporting also suggests that timing has become an increasingly important negotiating tool. Unlike previous trade reviews conducted around firm deadlines, the current review framework allows for recurrent discussions over an extended period. Rather than forcing governments toward a single make or minus break deadline, the agreement now provides regular opportunities to revisit unresolved issues. From a strategic perspective, this can reduce immediate pressure while extending the negotiation process. For policymakers, that creates both opportunities and challenges. A longer timeline allows difficult issues to be addressed gradually. At the same time, it also permits disagreements to persist, creating uncertainty for industries that rely on predictable investment decisions. Businesses generally prefer stability. Governments, however, sometimes see value in maintaining strategic flexibility. That difference helps explain why negotiations can appear to move slowly even when officials on both sides insist that progress is being made. So while headlines often focus on individual comments from political leaders, the more consequential developments usually occur away from cameras and technical working groups. Regulatory consultations, and sector-specific negotiations where the details of future market access are actually determined. And that raises the next question. If the negotiating framework has become more flexible and both governments continue emphasizing the importance of preserving North American trade, why has public rhetoric remained so tense? To answer that, we need to examine how the recent sequence of events unfolded and how political messaging and practical negotiation began to diverge. To understand why one short phrase generated so much attention, we need to step back and look at how negotiations have unfolded over the past several months. The disagreement did not begin with Mark Carney's recent comments. Instead, it reflects a much longer pattern of escalating trade disputes, repeated attempts to restart negotiations, and growing frustration on both sides of the border. According to public reporting, tensions began rising again after Washington signaled that several elements of the existing North American trade framework should be revisited during the next review cycle. American officials argued that portions of the agreement no longer reflected current economic realities, particularly in areas involving digital regulation, agriculture, and market access. Canadian officials acknowledged that a review was expected under the agreement, but emphasized that any revisions should preserve the overall stability of North American supply chains. Initially, both governments projected optimism. Senior officials described discussions as constructive, and both sides publicly reaffirmed the importance of maintaining one of the world's largest trading relationships, behind closed doors. However, reporting from multiple Canadian media organizations suggested that negotiations were proving more difficult than public statements indicated. Several reports claimed that U.S. negotiators wanted progress on specific policy issues before broader discussions could move forward. At the time of writing, neither government has officially characterized these conversations in identical terms, and many details remain based on anonymous sources familiar with the talks. Nevertheless, the reporting established a narrative that certain Canadian policy changes were being discussed before comprehensive negotiations would formally advance. As the months continued, Ottawa attempted several confidence-minus building measures. According to publicly available reports, Canada withdrew its proposed digital services tax after sustained objections from Washington. Officials described the decision as an effort to create a more constructive negotiating environment. Canada also eased several retaliatory trade measures that had been introduced during earlier disputes. From Ottawa's perspective, these moves demonstrated a willingness to reduce friction and reopen dialogue. Critics, however, argued that Canada had offered meaningful concessions without securing equally visible commitments in return. Whether that assessment is entirely accurate remains a matter of political debate, but it became an increasingly common criticism within Canadian policy circles. Former diplomats, provincial leaders, and trade analysts began openly questioning whether the negotiating process had become unbalanced. That debate reached a new level when several well-known Canadian figures publicly suggested that Washington was effectively asking for policy changes before formal bargaining had fully begun. Some commentators described this as an entry fee for negotiations. Others used even stronger language. It was against this backdrop that Prime Minister Mark Carney faced questions from reporters. His response attracted attention not because he disputed the existence of difficult negotiations, but because he carefully distinguished between the reported characterization and his own description of events. Carney stated that the phrase being discussed was not language he had personally used, nor language he had heard directly from President Trump. Notice what his statement did not say. He rejected a specific label. He did not explicitly deny that difficult preconditions had been discussed. That distinction quickly became the focus of political commentary. Supporters argued that the Prime Minister was simply correcting inaccurate reporting and refusing to amplify emotionally charged language. Critics interpreted the same answer differently. In their view, avoiding the phrase did little to address the broader concern that Canada had already made significant policy adjustments, while negotiations remained largely unresolved. Meanwhile, officials in Washington maintained their own public messaging. The Office of the United States Trade Representative continued emphasizing that the administration supported preserving the core structure of the North American Trade Agreement, while also seeking reforms in areas it viewed as unfair or outdated. Those statements suggested that the United States was not preparing to abandon the agreement altogether. Instead, the administration appeared focused on improving its bargaining position before making long-term commitments. This combination of firm public messaging and ongoing private negotiations created an unusual political environment. Each side insisted it wanted a successful agreement. Each side also argued that the other needed to demonstrate greater flexibility. For businesses operating across North America, the uncertainty itself became part of the problem. Automotive manufacturers, agricultural exporters, energy companies, and logistics firms generally value predictability above almost everything else. Investment decisions involving factories, supply contracts, or transportation infrastructure are often made years in advance. When governments signal that important trade rules may change but provide few specifics about timing or scope, companies frequently delay investments until greater clarity emerges. That economic uncertainty increased pressure on political leaders to demonstrate progress. Yet neither government wanted to appear weak domestically by making concessions too quickly. As a result, negotiations increasingly became a balancing act between diplomacy and domestic politics. Every public statement served multiple audiences. Foreign negotiators evaluated it for signs of flexibility. Financial markets searched for indications of future policy. Business leaders looked for reassurance that supply chains would remain stable. Meanwhile, voters in both countries judged whether their governments appeared strong enough to defend national interests. Against that backdrop, it becomes easier to understand why 6 words generated such disproportionate attention. The debate was never really about a single phrase. It was about what that phrase implied regarding leverage, bargaining strategy, and political positioning. And that leads to the larger strategic question. If neither Ottawa nor Washington appears willing to walk away from CUSMA, why has the rhetoric become increasingly confrontational? The answer may have less to do with the agreement itself than with the broader political and economic calculations shaping North American trade in the years ahead. So where does this leave the negotiations? At the time of writing, the most honest answer is that both governments appear to be pursuing 2 objectives simultaneously. They want to preserve North America's integrated trading system, while also maximizing their bargaining position before any revised agreement is finalized. Those goals are not necessarily contradictory. In fact, they often produce exactly the kind of public messaging we've been seeing. Washington continues to argue that parts of the current agreement require modernization. Officials have pointed to digital commerce, agricultural market access, and industrial competitiveness as areas where they believe American interests can be strengthened. From the U.S., applying pressure before formal negotiations is simply part of obtaining a stronger final deal. Ottawa, meanwhile, faces a very different challenge. Canada's economy remains deeply integrated with that of the United States. Roughly 3-quarters of Canadian merchandise exports still go to the American market, making the United States by far Canada's largest trading partner. That economic reality limits Ottawa's room for maneuver, but it doesn't eliminate it. Prime Minister Mark Carney has repeatedly emphasized diversification, expanding trade with Europe, strengthening partnerships in the Indo-Midas Pacific, and reducing long Midas term dependence on any single market. Those initiatives are unlikely to replace the U.S. market in the foreseeable future. However, they can improve Canada's negotiating position over time by giving policymakers additional options. This helps explain why Carney consistently frames the discussion around resilience rather than confrontation. His background may also matter. Having previously led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney spent years communicating during periods of financial uncertainty, where every public statement could influence markets within minutes. That experience will carry over into his political communication. Rather than escalating rhetoric, he often chooses carefully limited language that preserves flexibility for future negotiations. Whether that approach proves successful remains to be seen. Critics argue that measured language alone cannot compensate for an imbalance in leverage. Supporters counter that diplomacy often depends on avoiding unnecessary public confrontations while continuing difficult discussions behind closed doors. Both perspectives have merit. Trade negotiations rarely succeed because of dramatic speeches. More often, they are shaped by months of technical discussions conducted far from television cameras. Another factor worth considering is the structure of the review process itself. With the transition from a single high-stakes review deadline to a recurring annual review mechanism, negotiators now operate under a different timeline. Instead of racing toward one decisive moment, both governments have opportunities to revisit unresolved issues over multiple years. That changes incentives. It reduces the pressure created by an immediate deadline while increasing the importance of maintaining stable working relationships between negotiating teams. For businesses, that may ultimately be more significant than any single political headline. Companies making long term investments care less about daily political exchanges than they do about regulatory certainty. Automakers deciding where to build factories, manufacturers planning new supply chains, and agricultural exporters negotiating future contracts all need confidence that trade rules will remain predictable. If prolonged political disputes begin creating uncertainty, investment decisions can be delayed regardless of which government is technically winning the negotiation. This is why many economists argue that stability itself has measurable economic value. The longer uncertainty persists, the greater the potential cost for both countries. At the same time, neither government wants to appear politically weak. In Washington, Demonstrating toughness during trade negotiations has long been viewed as politically advantageous. In Ottawa, appearing to concede too quickly risks criticism from provincial governments, domestic industries, and opposition parties. That political balancing act means public messaging is often designed as much for domestic audiences as for foreign negotiators. This brings us back to the phrase that sparked the entire discussion. Was empathy an inaccurate description, or was it simply a politically inconvenient one? Based on publicly available information, reasonable observers can reach different conclusions. There is evidence suggesting that Canada made several policy adjustments before broader negotiations advanced. There is also evidence that both governments continue expressing support for maintaining the overall trade framework. Those facts are not mutually exclusive. Negotiations can involve genuine pressure tactics while still aiming toward eventual compromise. Perhaps the more important question is not whether one particular phrase is technically correct. The more important question is whether the negotiating process produces reciprocal progress going forward. If future discussions begin generating concrete movement from both sides, then today's debate over terminology may quickly fade into the background. If, however, one side continues making concessions without visible movement in return, criticism of the current strategy will almost certainly intensify. Ultimately, the success of these negotiations won't be measured by press conferences or carefully chosen wording. It will be measured by the agreement that eventually emerges and whether businesses, workers, and consumers across North America believe it provides greater certainty than the one it replaces. For now, the headlines focus on a few carefully chosen words. History will probably pay much more attention to what follows them, and that's the part of the story we'll be watching closely. If you enjoy in-minus depth analysis that goes beyond the headlines and examines the strategic logic behind major international events, consider subscribing. There will almost certainly be more developments in these negotiations, and when new information becomes available, we'll break down what changed, why it matters, and what it could mean for North America's economic future.